I will concentrate now first to draw a picture about the evolution of the Weimar Republic. Because remember, the Weimar Republic, if we divide up the time period that it existed, from 1919 on, or from 1918 on, late 1918, until 1933, there were distinctly three time periods. The first time period, that was the troublesome birth of the Weimar Republic. From 1918 to 1923, it was a sequence of crises. And in this sequence of crises, Hitler was the one who made the putsch in 1923. Then begins the second time period, from 1924 to 1929. And it looked as if the second time period could be considered as a time of normalcy. It looked now, ultimately, the Weimar Republic is now operating normally. But that was a mistake, that was an illusion. There were distinctly signs that this was not as normal as it looked from the outside. And then, of course, we have the third time period from 1929 until 1933. That is the end of the Weimar Republic, the beginning of the great economic crisis with the impact it had on Germany. So now I do concentrate on 1924. We have seen last time what conclusions, what lessons Hitler was drawing from his failed putsch of November 9th to the 8th to the November. Let's not make a mistake. November 23rd. We will see now how the Weimar Republic evolved. Now, first of all, a country very often depends, as far as its consolidation or its stability is concerned, to the presence of one man who inspires great confidence, domestically as well as abroad. Now, from 1924 to 1929, the Weimar Republic had such a remarkable statesman. He was sometimes called, in the French historiography, the good German, as if all the others were bad or wicked. And I have already mentioned this man's name. It was Gustav Stresemann. It is the one who solved the problem of the currency and of the French occupation of the Ruhr. Now, Stresemann will remain until 3 weeks before October 1929. He died 3 weeks before the great crisis started. But he enjoyed a tremendous prestige and confidence, even though he was essentially in nearly all the governments which followed from 1924 to 1929, not chancellor, but minister of foreign affairs. But as such, he had a great influence, and he was a man whose presence and his political activity was essentially geared at supporting and consolidating the Weimar Republic. But in 1929 he was gone, and this was a very bad blow. The death of Stresemann, he died from stress practically, because he was involved in most things. So this was a bad blow for the Weimar Republic. But let's have a look now on the political situation. In 1924, the man who was president of the Republic was Friedrich Ebert, a socialist, and this Friedrich Ebert had all the credentials of the Democrat, of the honest man who respected the Constitution. But I might already have mentioned that beforehand when we spoke about the Weimar Constitution. In 1925, Ebert was attacked viciously by the nationalists, and he was even cited to court. And his doctor told him that he should absolutely undergo surgical intervention for appendicitis, but he just wanted still to defend himself before court. And as you can imagine, what happened was his appendicitis, it broke, and he died from a broken, do you call that appendicitis or appendix? Yeah. So once he was dead, the question was, who would be the successor. There was, among the other parties, there was nobody famous, prestigious enough to have a chance to succeed. So ultimately, the Weimar parties, that is the socialists, the Catholics and the liberals, they turned then towards a man whose credentials were not exactly that of a convinced supporter of the Weimar Republic, but who was an honest man, that was Field Marshal Hindenburg. Hindenburg was then nominated by the Weimar Party. It was a little bit a paradoxical situation, because the parties with whom he did not like, they nominated him for election, and he won the elections in 1925. So Hindenburg became president from 1925 until 1932. Now he was an honest man, all right, but he was an old man. He was already in his late 70s when he was elected. Later on he will even run again for a second mandate when he was in his late 80s. So despite his honesty, he was exposed to an environment. He had a number of people surrounding him which were nationalists, conservatives. One of those was his son, Oskar Hindenburg, who was a colonel of World War I, and there were others. We will discover those when we get to the year 1929. So, and as he was suffering, let's say later on, from a certain mental debility, he could be maneuvered, manipulated. So he was, in times of normalcy, everything was all right. But in times of danger, all depended on who would have an influence over him, because he could be manipulated, and he will be later on. So in other words, he was a liability in case a troublesome period would begin, and such a period did begin from October 1929 on. But of course, from 1924 until 1929, nobody was aware of that. Then there was a second individual. I put his name on the whiteboard. That is Hugenberg. Hugenberg was the leader of the German nationalists. Now, the German nationalists, or the staunch conservatives, they were not enthusiastic supporters of the Weimar Republic. They were somehow, I would say, of mixed credentials. But when Hugenberg, from 1926 on, when he became leader of the nationalists, he frankly declared that he wanted to do away with the Weimar Republic. In other words, he declared openly his hostility to the constitution, to the Weimar Republic. Now, besides the nationalists, there were two other parties who had in their political program that they were hostile to the Weimar Republic. The first one, from the beginning on, were the communists, those who had failed to impose a Soviet-type regime. So the German communists, they were not now a huge party, but a middle-sized party, and they were growing in influence. They were anti-Weimarian. They wanted to do away with the Weimar Republic. And the last one, this was the Nazis. Now, the Nazis in 1924 or in 1926, they were a small splinter group of no importance. But this will change from 1929 on. Important is that among the many parties represented in the Weimar Parliament, 3 of them were openly hostile to the survival of the Weimar Republic. Now, Hugenberg was not an anybody. He was very powerful because he came from big industry. And not only did he have big industry behind him, but he also had a real media empire. He controlled a number of German newspapers, and he also controlled the German film industry. The UFA film, this was Hugenberg's property. In other words, in terms of media, Hugenberg was very influential to influence German public opinion. You have a question?
Yeah, was Hitler one of the Nazis that was in the Weimar Parliament at this time?
No.
No, he never was.
No.
Okay.
He did not run to be a member in the. He had his followers be a part of the parliament. He hated parliament too much. He would not run for it.
Okay.
So, in other words, Hugenberg, with his influential press and media imperium, was slowly undermining the confidence the German public opinion might have had into the functioning of the Weimar Constitution. Now, so far for that. I come now to another problem, which also, I think, was a basic problem. That is the economic situation of Germany. The economic situation of Germany was, from the beginning on in an extremely difficult strait. And the reason why the German economy was overburdened, was jeopardized, was essentially the reparation claim. The German economy was carrying along with it an 132 billion gold weight, which they would have to pay back over the years. Now, this was a tremendous amount of money, and Germany was exhausted. Germany was ruined. One reason we have already seen that was the inflation of 1923, which destroyed the German currency and also ruined an important part of the German middle class. So in other words, this reparation issue will poison the atmosphere in two ways. First, domestically speaking, because the reparations were continuously an argument for the nationalists and for the Nazis to attack the Weimar Republic and to make them responsible for these reparations. They called it an enslavement for generations. So in other words, they could not defend themselves against the attacks that this inflation business was still not solved. Now, the fact is that they got in 1924, when Stresemann solved the problem of the currency, they got, after the name of an American politician who was a former general, Dawes. This American Dawes had presided over a committee which alleviated the back payment of the reparation. In other words, they would not have to pay a tremendous amount in terms of annuity, but they were stretched. These reparations were stretched over many years. That was the Dawes plan, which made it easier for them to pay. And then afterwards, in 1929, shortly before he died, Stresemann had managed to get even a better plan, also elaborated under American guidance, and this American who had presided over this commission was Young, therefore it was called the Young Plan. But Dawes' plan or Young Plan did not, made it, let's say, less difficult to make the payments, but they did not change the situation basically. The German economy had this liability with it, and all German governments followed an economic policy until the end, until Hitler came to power. They followed an economic policy avoiding to make reserves, avoiding to put aside an amount of reserves for bad days. Because had they done this, then the Allies should have said, look, you are perfectly able to put enough aside so that you can make the reparation payment. So what they did now, they lived as a government, as we say, from hand to mouth. That is, the German governments operated essentially on foreign loans, which allowed them to invest and to get the economy going. And among those who were giving loans to Germany, there were the United States and American investors were there in the first place. So in other words, from 1924 on, the German economy very narrowly depended on what was going on in the United States. If in the United States everything was all right, then the Germans could continue to operate the way they did. But, and that is what happened in October 1929, when a crisis did strike, the country in Europe which immediately was hit by the same crisis was the Weimar Republic, because no American loans would be forthcoming. On the contrary, the United States would withdraw all those loans and all this advance money they had put at the disposal of the Weimar Republic. So in other words, the reparation issue, by poisoning the atmosphere, in domestically speaking, allowing the nationalists and the Nazis to attack continuously the Weimar Republic, also made it impossible a frank, honest reconciliation between France and Germany. The French insisted that these reparations should be made, and the Germans felt that as long as the British and the French insisted upon this, that they could not establish normally functioning relations in international terms. So in other words, from 1924 till 1929, it looked as if everything was for the best in the best of all worlds, but in reality, there were under the surface, there were grave dangers. One related to the power of the president and the Weimar Constitution, the other to the political spectrum of the German political parties, and then ultimately the economic policy which made it impossible to get a sound, solid economy going, because the reparation issue spoiled everything. And then, of course, in this delicate situation of, let's say, liabilities and problems, Stresemann died. And Stresemann's death, in a sense, even before the crisis did strike, Stresemann's death was a very bad omen. This meant that from now on there would be nobody prestigious enough inside the Weimar Republic to have a firm hand and to guide the Weimar Republic through the difficult years to come. Now by 1929, the great economic crisis started in the United States. Now, I suppose that in your grammar school or in your high school or maybe even at university that you studied this great economic crisis from 1929, so that you know what the basic reasons were. To some degree, the reasons were similar to the ones we are facing now, for the crisis which has began in September 2008 with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. It was over-speculation at the stock exchange, overproduction, and overextended credit. All those causes united, and what of course brought everything down was essentially that one of the big business banks, Lehman Brothers, one of the four big banks, that was a mistake by Bernanke and by the American government, that they allowed, even though nobody was particularly enthusiastic about the man who was at the head of Lehman Brothers. He was a terrible fellow. But nonetheless, regardless of the individual, it was a mistake to let him down. They did not repeat the same mistake when similar bankruptcies came up, but they might not have come up had Lehman Brothers been saved. Whatever the case, a stock exchange problem became a financial problem, and a financial problem became an economic problem. And an economic problem became a social problem, because that is a spiral which, when it turns, the negative effects are far-reaching, and they are, in reality, even though it is not exactly the same, but there are nonetheless strange kinds of similarities between the ingredients which were behind the crisis of 1929 and the ingredients which triggered off the crisis of 2008, which is again, and I am sad to tell you that, which is again a very hard lesson we can learn from history, precisely that the political, financial and economic responsibles don't learn the lesson from history. Otherwise, this should have been avoided. Anyway, as you are aware of what the crisis meant, you know what happened in the United States after the crash at Wall Street, at the stock exchange, came then the financial problem, and then it became an economic problem. And the economic problem ended up in a social problem with millions of people losing their job. Now, in 1929, in the United States had a Republican administration, Hoover. And in those days, they were still, I would say, classical liberals. In other words, they still believed, hard like iron, that the state should abstain from interfering in the economic field, in the economy. That the economy would somehow find by its own, through the so-called invisible hand, a way out of the crisis. But of course, John Maynard Keynes had warned against this, that this would not happen. So the Hoover administration, by not doing anything, allowed the crisis from getting deeper and deeper. The only thing Hoover made was to declare in 1931 a moratorium of debts. In other words, all those who were indebted for 1 year did not have to pay their debts back to their creditors. But that was not a fundamental decision. So in other words, the United States only got out of the crisis when a political change came, when FDR won the elections, and when he came with his New Deal policy. You know that. Now, the New Deal policy of FDR, it is hard to know, he certainly was aware that there was John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes had already made his proposals before, but I would not like to say that it was thanks to Keynes that the United States ultimately with FDR got out of the crisis. Because simply the good ideas, the positive ideas, as we say, they do not only grow in one garden. So in other words, Roosevelt probably came to the same conclusion, the same as Keynes. That is also why there were two countries which will get out of the crisis. But of course that was late when the move out of the crisis began. And it took many years before they came out of the crisis. One was the United States, and the other one was England. In the United States, a political change occurred. The Democrats did come to power and will stay in power for the next 20 years, until Eisenhower in the early 50s. In England, the Conservatives, even though there were coalition governments, the Conservatives' influence was growing. In both cases, they applied deficit spending policy in order to get people to work, in order to give business again orders so that the economy would start moving again. And of course, once this would take place, then of course the budgets had to be put in balance in order to cover those deficits, which had been staggering, but in no comparison to what's going on now. Now you know that the deficits, they are abysmal. You get dizzy when you think about it. Anyway, but there seems to be no other way out. Nonetheless, and I would like to insist upon this, this had as a consequence that in both countries, the administrations in the States as well as in England, they concentrated on the economic problem and they abstained from interfering in foreign policy, that is, in international relations. The United States withdrew into a position which they had already occupied, now even deeper, into a position of splendid isolation, and the British more or less did the same. They will do everything to avoid taking strong action if, in the international relations in the late 30s, dictators threatened the international peace. Then the British would follow. We will see that a policy for which Chamberlain Neville Chamberlain stood for, that was a policy of appeasement. In the United States, it was splendid isolation. But Let me now turn towards Europe and see how, because this was a world crisis, no country, there was only one country which escaped from being hit by this crisis, and that was the Soviet Union. I'll say a word about it in just a moment. But all other countries in Europe and even outside were exposed to the consequences of this crisis. First, I already mentioned England, and I have already said enough so that we do not have to concentrate on that. The other country will be Germany. Germany was even more vulnerable, and the impact of the crisis is simply that the Weimar Republic went down the drain and Hitler had a chance to come to power. We will see that in greater detail. In other words, we'll come back to the situation in Germany. The other European country, which seemed to have escaped for a while, was France. France had, by that time, an economy which was, to some degree, I'm nearly tempted to say self-sufficient. They did not have, they did not depend greatly on foreign imports or exports. In other words, they considered France as being like a common French market, so they were not that much exposed to the immediate consequences of the crisis. But they will not escape. In other words, the French were hit by the crisis, the latest. The French only were practically confronted by the crisis from 1932 on. That is when the others were at the bottom, the French started to get them at the bottom. Now in France, the crisis had devastating effects not only on the French economy, but also on the French political system. Because in France, the country, and this is a common feature the French have had since the French Revolution. In France, the country was always divided in two blocks, a left and a right. And they hated one another so deeply that when one came to power after the other one, the one who came to power would usually do the opposite. So in other words, there was no continuity. One was undoing what the others had done. And of course, this way, you will not get out of the crisis. And the hatred between these two blocks, the left and the right, was so great that one of the French right wing, we could say fascist practically leaders, said, better Hitler than Blum. Now, Hitler was already in power by the mid-30s when he made this statement. And Blum was the socialist, first socialist prime minister in France. In other words, the head of the left. So this gives you an idea how disruptive the French domestic policy was. Now, because France was torn apart by this antagonism, there was even at a given moment a danger that, like in Spain, that a civil war might break out, that the French right might get at the French left's throat. Now, it did not get so far, but it nonetheless gives you an idea that the situation was a very unhealthy, very unsound one. So what was the consequence? Number one was that the French will not get, by their own means, out of the crisis. They will either stagnate or get even deeper into it. And secondly, as they did not get out of the crisis, in foreign policy, they became so weak that they ultimately practically aligned themselves to what the British were doing. In other words, from 1936 on, France ceased, we will see that when we see international relations, France ceased to follow an independent great power international politics, which they had so far done. They just aligned themselves on the British. And the British followed the policy, remember what I just said before, of appeasement. That is, of not doing anything to antagonize the dictators. So in this regard, the economic crisis practically neutralized France as a great power. The French will be exposed to all kinds of influences. They will not act, they will not take responsible action against what they saw in terms of violations of international law and aggressions of other countries' territories, as Mussolini and as Hitler will do it from the mid-30s on. So France, in that sense, was very badly hit. It came in late, but it did not get out of it, really. How about Italy? Now, Italy was from 1922 on a fascist dictatorship. Mussolini was a dictator. He was the duce, the head of the government, but you should nonetheless not forget that despite the fact that he was the strong man in the state, as duce and head of government, Italy had nonetheless a head of state. And this head of state was a king. Now the Italian king allowed Mussolini to do what he was doing. In other words, he did not interfere with Mussolini's, neither his domestic dictatorial policy nor his crazy foreign policy to follow Hitler into the abyss. And that is why, because the king had made all those concessions to Mussolini, that at the end of World War II, the Italians in a referendum voted the abolition of the monarchy. The king had to go. So from that moment on, Italy was a republic. But let's come back to Mussolini. When the crisis did hit, because Mussolini, after all, he was presiding over a state-controlled economy. This was not a free economy. The state controlled everything. But Italy was not a very rich country. In other words, Italy depended a lot on foreign imports for food, for gas, for energy, and for raw materials. So in other words, whether Mussolini liked it or not, he could not avoid being exposed to the crisis. So as a consequence, a number of hardship did strike the Italian population. In terms of food, they could not get all they were accustomed to. And so as a consequence, a certain unrest spread through the country, despite the fact that this was a totalitarian dictatorship, but people were unhappy, simply because of the scarcity of a number of food products. Now, how did Mussolini react to this? Mussolini reacted two ways in order to overcome this latent dissatisfaction which was spreading under the surface. First of all, he tightened the dictatorship. In other words, he would now arrest people much faster if they dared to criticize. But that was not all. From the mid-30s on, he applied a classical means which dictators or dictatorial governments, authoritarian governments, have in history always used. That is, divert the attention of his people towards an outside adventure, that is, towards an aggressive foreign policy. By the mid-30s, Mussolini will, even before Hitler started, he will attack an African colony, an African country which had remained the only unoccupied country in Africa. It was not a colony, it was an independent country. And that was Ethiopia. Italy had colonies on both sides of Ethiopia, Somalia and Eritrea. So Mussolini attacked and conquered Ethiopia, allegedly to provide living space for the Italian population. But in reality, it was a movement of diversion. So the Italians could look towards Ethiopia and be proud of the achievement of their army there, but they did not have too many reasons to be proud. So in other words, he tried to divert the attention, but the consequence was that if this Ethiopian war ultimately will bring Mussolini in a tight dependency on Hitler. So in other words, the link Italy will, from the mid-30s on, until the beginning of World War II, tighten with Germany will be disastrous. Hitler will practically pull him in the same boat when he started World War II. So in other words, the economic crisis had very negative consequences in the years which followed for the evolution of the Italian state. How far now? Well, who were now the other countries which, in Europe which played a certain role? One was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had, when the crisis began in 1929, they had a new master, a new dictatorial leader, Stalin. And Stalin practically at the same time, when the Western economies were plunging into the deepest crisis since Karl Marx, Stalin had launched the 5 years plan. In other words, his revolution, his state-organized revolution. And the state-organized revolution, I will not make a lecture on what he was doing, but keep in mind, he collectivized agriculture, he abolished private property of collective farms who would allow the Communist Party to control the peasants, and he launched on a deep-going industrialization. Stalin wanted to catch up in 10 years in terms of coal production, in terms of steel production, with countries like Germany or England. So in other words, and he did this by an extremely tight dictatorial grip over his own people. So in other words, Stalin was untouched by the economic crisis which hit the West. On the contrary, as he was celebrating progress in his own Stalin revolution, some Western intellectuals were taken in and started admiring, as the Western system was in crisis, Stalin's system, which seemed to be on the way up. Stalin was even taking advantage of the crisis in Western Europe because he hired thousands of European and American engineers, technicians, and paid a lot for them. And they helped him build up his steel industry and his great electrical power plants on the Don and on other places. So in other words, Western specialists were hired to help him build up his economy. So far for Stalin. A last word about the other country which will also play a role in international relations, and that was Japan. Japan had participated in World War I, but only very superficially. The Japanese had only occupied the German islands in the Pacific, not all. The United States will occupy some of them, and a number of German strongholds on the Chinese mainland. But otherwise they had not participated actively in the victory. That is why they did not participate in the peace negotiations in Paris. From 1920 on now, until 1930, Japan had a liberal government. And this liberal government had an economic and a foreign policy which to some degree resembled the Japanese government in the 50s and 60s. In other words, this liberal government wanted to expand Japanese economic influence to the Far East, that is to the islands, to the Chinese mainland, and you must not forget, at that time, Japan had the sovereignty from 1910 on over Korea, also over Taiwan, and so in other words, they tried to win foreign markets. They abstained from military expansionism, but they practiced what was called economic expansionism. The crisis now in Japan allowed a minority of the Japanese military and industrial leadership who were ultra-nationalists to make a coup and seize power in Tokyo. They even, before they seized power in Tokyo, they had even started attacking mainland China. So in other words, even though the Japanese did not suffer, economically speaking, directly from the crisis as much as others, but in Japan, the ultranationalists, among the military and among the industrialists, they did take advantage to seize power. And then, once they seized power, from 1931 on, they invaded Manchuria. Now, Manchuria is a territory, a geographical territory today. It does not carry the same name. There are 3 Chinese provinces which are located west of Korea, Manchuria, and they are the richest areas of China. They are rich in agricultural resources, grain and rice, but they are also rich in mineral resources, coal and steel. So the Japanese put their hand, they conquered this militarily, and in order to get away internationally, they proclaimed this territory an empire of Manchukuo, but that was of course a fiction. The Japanese had this under control. You could say, to some degree, that this was the beginning of World War II in the Far East, this occupation by the Japanese army of these Chinese provinces. Yes?
What year did they invade Manchuria?
1931. And the international community reacted very meekly. The United States were in the midst of their economic crisis, the British too. So what they did was they set up a commission to analyze they made an appeal to the Japanese to withdraw. Of course, the Japanese did not follow. And then it is a kind of strange thing. They acted the same way towards Japan as they have been acting now towards Iran since the discussions over the Iranian nuclear project. That is, from discussion to discussion, the Iranians are doing what they want, the Japanese were doing what they want. So in other words, this had far-reaching consequences in Japan and in the Far East, because sometimes historians consider that World War II started in the Far East in 1937, when the Japanese openly attacked China. But some historians have come to the conclusion that without war declaration, occupying the richest area of China, that was already the beginning of the confrontation with China and the beginning of World War II in the Far East. I'm sure that on the long run, when history will be reappraised and reevaluated, that this will be considered as such. Anyway, so we have made the tour. These were the consequences of the economic crisis and the political implications this crisis had. Now, the most important impact of the crisis was, of course, in Germany, and also its political implications. And that is why we will turn now towards Germany. Then we will see Hitler's slow rise to power from October 1929 on until January 1933. So I have drawn up in order to allow you to understand better the political situation in the German parliament, because for an American it's extremely complicated to get familiar with the political situation in Europe, because whereas you in the States you have 2 parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, roughly speaking the Republicans having closer links to big business, the Democrats having closer links to the trade unions, and each party having nonetheless a middle class following. In Europe, you have, in most countries from the beginning on, not a division in 2, but a division in 3. You have, it starts usually with a left and the right. The conservatives on the right side. On the left side, you have socialist or communist. And then in the middle, you have the Liberal Party, or let's say a center party. Now, very often you do not have even 3 parties or 4 or 5, but you have a multiplicity of parties. Nonetheless, the great denominations, the great divisions are right, left, center. Here, when we begin now on the right side, on the extreme right side, you have the Nazis, NSDAP, the Nazis. Then close to the Nazis, barely less conservative, as a nationalist, DNVP. If you want to put a name under each of those, NSDAP, that's Hitler. DNVP, the nationalists or the conservatives, that's Hugenberg. Then further, if we move further to the middle, to the right center, you have the DVP. Now the DVP, these are the right center liberals. That was the party of Stresemann. Of course, Stresemann was gone. And then when we move further to the center, then we come to the Catholic party, the Zentrum. This is a Catholic party. Now, I will give you a name which will fit this. That will be Brüning. I'll put him on the blackboard later on. Then and when we move further to the left, then we have the left center liberals, DDP. DDP, I can spell it for you. I can spell all of them, but I'll give you just the meaning. It means the center liberals. And then you move further to the left, then you have the socialists, the SPD. And ultimately, if you move still further to the left, you have the communists, the KPD. Now, these parties, which are nearly 10, yes?
Was DDP left center or just center liberals?
It was more or less left center.
Okay.
Left center. My own drawing is not just perfect. Yes?
Could you spell the Catholic one that starts with a Z?
Zentrum. Z-E-N-T-R-U-M. Zentrum, center. You know, this is the foreigner party of the CDU, CSU, now in the German parliament. Now, this here, I just put on the blackboard those parties which were nationally representative, that is, which had national representations. But besides those, these 10, there were about 20 other ones who had just regional or local character. And they had then sometimes only 1 or 2 parliamentarians. We leave this, we leave this aside. But simply by looking here at the whiteboard, you understand that with the electoral law, which they had, guaranteeing a proportionate amount of seats to any party who would get votes, this made practically a stable government practically impossible. The reason why I did draw this on the blackboard is that we need to have a clear idea when we begin now. When the crisis did strike in October 1929, there was a coalition government which included, when you have looked now, you'll see, which included on the left the socialist, SPD, then the DDP, the center liberals, left center liberals, then the Catholics, Centrum, and the DVP, the right-wing liberals. In other words, there are 4 parties formed this coalition. It was the Müller-Bauer government. Now, even if you forget the name Müller-Bauer, doesn't matter. Keep in mind, it was a coalition government which united 4 parties, from the socialists to the right-wing liberals. Now, this coalition had one important drawback from the beginning on. The SPD, yes?
Which 4 were those again?
SPD, DDP, Centrum, DVP. Now, the SPD, the socialists, they represented essentially the trade unions, whereas the DVP on the right side the right-wing liberals, they represented big business. Now you can imagine when a crisis of the magnitude of the one of October 1929 did strike, that this had devastating effects on the German economy, with bankruptcies, with a recession. In other words, that was an economic impact, but it also had a social impact. That was the layoff, the unemployment of many workers, unlike what's going on today. Today, the political and also the economic responsibles, they have found a trick which sometimes works when they go on half employment, that they keep the workers in the factories but give them only half a job. At least they are not laid off. But in those days that did not exist. So in other words, the economic recession on the one side and unemployment on the other. The problem was now, when this Bauer-Müller government had to take action, that is between October 1929 and the spring of 1930, they could not agree. Because the socialists, they wanted to take government measures to alleviate the misery of the unemployed, to help those who were unemployed. Whereas the DVP, the right-wing liberals, they wanted to take measures to relaunch the economy, to do something against the recession. And because the government did not have, in those days, unlike what's going on today, there was a sacrosanct principle that was one had to avoid by all means deficit spending. In other words, you cannot spend the money you don't have. And this became like an unwritten doctrine in the German political, historical tradition until the present day, even if many exceptions have been made. My question to you is the following. From which experience have they become totally allergic against deficit spending?
For which country? For Germany?
From which experience have the Germans become totally opposed to deficit spending?
Is it the reparations they had to pay?
Yes, more precisely what? We have seen that
World War I and all this.
afterwards.
The inflation.
The inflation the inflation of 1923. The inflation of 1923 was the immediate outcome of this deficit spending. So, in other words, they did not want to do deficit spending. So, what could they do? And they did not have enough in their financial reserves to vote unemployment goals and at the same time support to the big business. So what the governments very often do when they cannot agree, the different parts, what they usually then decide to do?
Or a vote?
They do nothing.
Nothing. They didn't do anything, because had they spent money for the trade unions, the DVP would have reacted. Had the DVP got money for the business, then the socialists would have reacted. And what was the consequence of this? As they didn't do a thing, the crisis was getting deeper. In other words, the unemployment, the layoff, the unemployment statistics were rising rapidly. So by the spring of 1930, it became evident that something had to be done. One could not continue just letting things go down, the same as Hoover was doing in the United States. And so in these circumstances, one man moved now behind the stage and used his influence on the president to have a new chancellor appointed. Now this one man, I put his name there, Schleicher. Schleicher was a general. He was a general, but he was a general who had an exceptional position inside the German state and inside the German army. He was the go-between between, on the one side, the president and the Ministry of Defense, but also the go-between between the president and the head of the army. So in other words, he was unavoidable in this relationship with the president, with the Ministry of Defense, or with the army. And he was an intriguer, an operator, a manipulator, who wanted to stay out of the limelight while at the same time having an important influence. So Schleicher came to see the president and told Hindenburg that he had to dismiss the government, this coalition government, and had to appoint a member of the Zentrum government by the name of Brüning. Brüning was a member of the Catholic Party. Now, the Catholic Party, as it is a religious party, as you can imagine, that it was not religion which made the distinction between in what sense he was practically tending. He was a conservative Catholic. You have sometimes also socially minded Catholic. Brüning was a conservative Catholic, and he was given the order by President Hindenburg to form a government. Now, yes,
What was the role that Brüning was given?
Brüning was a member of the Catholic Party, and he was a conservative Catholic, as opposed to more socially minded Catholics.
What position was he given?
He was appointed Chancellor, head of government. And of course, when Hindenburg appointed him head of government, he had to look to find a majority for his economic policy. Now, Brüning was more inclined to do something for the economy rather than to do something for the unemployed. And so he set up a program where he practically announced that he would do something in order to get the economy rolling again. But of course, in this case, the socialists told him that they would not vote for him. And without the socialists, he had no majority. In other words, he was in a dilemma. He wanted to have an economic policy doing something for big business, but he could not do it without the socialists, and the socialists said, no, we want something to be done for the workers. And when Brüning now could not find a solution in negotiating with socialists, then he made his first major mistake. He went to see the president. It was a situation of crisis, spring of 1930, and asked the president to dissolve parliament, to organize new elections. Now, the worst a government can do is to organize elections in a moment when they are in the midst of a crisis. Because when you are in the midst of a crisis, all the miscontent, all the dissatisfaction is directed against the government. So in other words, by dissolving parliament, this was absolutely crazy. He had expected, that was totally unrealistic, that in these new elections he might get a majority. When the elections now were held and the results came out, everybody was stunned. Because from that moment on, spring 1930 on, begins the rise of Adolf Hitler. So in 1928, the communists, that is before the crisis started, the communists had 54 seats in parliament. The Nazis, 12. Now, with Brüning's elections, the situation changed dramatically. The communists came out with 77 and the Nazis with 108.
What year was that?
1930. The elections which Brüning organized. So in other words,
How many people in Parliament were there this morning?
roughly speaking, 600. Now, so in other words, what I said just before, it is always a terrible mistake for a government to dissolve parliament to organize new elections in a situation of crisis. Because a majority of the population will vote against it, as this majority will make the government responsible. So this is exactly what happened. Now, when you see, now the Nazis and the communists, they had now close to 180, that is, they had nearly 1/3 of the votes. So in other words, Brüning now had a much more difficult situation to find a majority, because the growth of the communists and the growth of the Nazis, have a look here on this spectrum. This growth of the communists and growth of the Nazis went at the expense of the parties in the middle. That is, the socialists lost a little bit, the Zentrum lost a little bit, the DDP, DVP, in other words, the extremist parties, they won. And here we have two parties, Nazis and communists, which have as their openly proclaimed goal to destroy the Weimar Republic. So in other words, there could not be a coalition with one of them, because what they wanted was to bring the Weimar Republic down. So Brüning then tried, of course the situation was much more difficult, he tried to negotiate with the socialists once more. But when the socialists made conditions, he would not insist. He broke off the negotiations with the socialists. In other words, he gave up the possibility to gain a majority in parliament. Now what could he do, from what you know of the Weimar Constitution, if he could not get a majority in parliament?
He declare an emergency. Power.
He would simply, he went to see the president and told the president that this was an emergency situation and that the president should begin ruling by presidential decree, that is bypassing parliament. And that was Brüning's second mistake, because you cannot, and he will use this means, which was provided by the Weimar Constitution for an emergency situation. Now, of course, as the word implies, an emergency situation is an exceptional situation. It is not something you can repeat over years. But Brüning will use now this presidential decree for 2 years to rule bypassing parliament. And what will be the consequence of this abusive practice of the presidential, of resorting to the presidential decree? What do you think? What does that mean in practical terms? When a president uses his presidential, his dictatorial powers, disregarding parliament, and he runs the country for 2 years without referring, what kind of a regime is this de facto? That is a dictatorship. Now, of course, you could say that Hindenburg was not a bloodthirsty dictator, and that Brüning was a Democrat. But the way he handled the constitutional power of the president was de facto dictatorial power. And this had as a consequence that the German people got accustomed to live under a de facto dictatorial power. So later on, when Hitler was close, when Hitler had come to power, and when he requested that he should be given dictatorial powers, there was a precedent. Brüning had used these dictatorial powers, but he had not abused of them. He had not used these dictatorial powers to abolish the Weimar Constitution. He had just run the country without having a majority in parliament. But he made another mistake, which also will have disastrous consequences. And this other mistake was he had one obsession: to get rid of the reparation payments. In other words, the reparation payments were what he felt were like a stone on the neck of the Weimar Republic. He had to get rid of it. And so he practiced a policy in order to convince the Allies that Germany could not survive if they did not agree to drop the reparation payment. And this policy was a policy of deflation. Deflation. What is a policy of deflation? It is, as the name implies, just the opposite of a policy of inflation. So a policy of deflation means Brüning tried to keep the German currency strong, to have a balanced budget, to cut government expenditures, to reduce even the salaries of the public service. In other words, he was cutting expenses by all means. And what were the consequences of this deflationary policy? The number of unemployed was growing rapidly. From 3 million, the number of from 3 million in the spring of 1930, the number of unemployed was growing to 5 to 6 million in 1932. And of course, even though the number of unemployed was rising, for that matter, business was not starting again rolling. Business was itself in difficulties. There were many bankruptcies, there were many businesses had to close. So in other words, Brüning's economic policy did not bring Germany out of the crisis. But politically speaking, it had a double consequence. First, domestically speaking, and then in foreign policy. Domestically speaking, it simply practically pushed the German masses into the arms of the communists and the Nazis, because the communists and the Nazis, they continued to accuse Brüning and the Weimar Republic of being totally incompetent, of not being able to get Germany out of the crisis. So in other words, the extremist parties following would only be growing as a consequence. But that was not all. Brüning now turned to the Western Allies, to the French and to the British in 1931, and told them, now, he said, now look, despite of the young lad who has brought, let's say, alleviations in payment, we cannot continue to operate our country. You have to drop your reparation claims. The British and the French, they said yes on one condition. They were willing to drop their claims on reparation. But they said, we will only drop our claims if the United States will drop their claims that we should pay back the $10 billion which we have borrowed from the United States from the end of World War I on. So in other words, the French and the British made a condition that first the United States had to drop their claims to them, because they said we have to pay this money we owe the merchants with the reparation payment. Hoover, we are in 1931. Hoover was, politically speaking, in no position, neither before the Congress nor before the American people, to drop those claims on the 10 billion debts which the French and the British had towards the United States. So Hoover would say, okay, look, we cannot drop those claims, but we are willing to grant moratorium. So in other words, nobody has to make any payment in case of debts or in case of reparations for 1 year. But this did not solve Brüning's problem, because Brüning wanted to get rid of the reparation. This was a delayed solution which was not satisfactory. So he tried that. We have at least one positive achievement on his political record. So he started negotiating with the Austrians to sign with Austria a customs union. the Weimar Republic customs union with Austria. Now, this customs union with Austria might have not decisively influenced the economic evolution. But this customs union, of course, did ring a bell with the French, because in the 19th century, the Prussians had used the customs union they had imposed upon Germany to unite Germany. From a customs union, all of a sudden, political union came out under Bismarck. So in other words, the French were hypersensitive. They vetoed this move. They said that they would, under no circumstances, let this customs union with Austria taking place. And of course, Bruni couldn't do it if the French were against it. But that was not all. The French, furious, the French did then, in order to punish the Germans and to punish the Austrians, the French did withdraw their capital investment in a big German bank in southern Germany and in a big Austrian bank in Vienna. So that the French withdrawal of their investments had as a consequence that the two banks, which were very big business banks, they went bankrupt. So in other words, far away from doing something in positive terms, so that he could say, look what I have done, the failure to achieve this customs union brought even Germany and Austria deeper down into the crisis as a consequence of the French reaction. So in other words, Brüning was totally compromised in this tenure. He had not solved the problem, and what of course was the worst, he knew that his deflationary policy was disastrous for millions of Germans who lost their jobs. But he continued nonetheless by telling them, hold out a little longer, we will ultimately get rid of the reparation. And that was, of course, a miscalculation. You cannot achieve a goal in foreign policy by banking on the misery of your own population. Because he deliberately used the unemployment rising rate as an argument with the Allies. But the Allies were not sensitive to this. And the German public would not forgive or forget this. So what happened now was we will get into the midst of the crisis, into the decisive year of 1932. In 1932, there was a year of many elections. And there was one election which was coming up, and this election was the election for the presidency in March 1932. Because Hindenburg's mandate came to an end. He was already by that time 86 or close to 87. There had to be elections. And this was a very important issue because these elections did take place in the middle of the crisis. So the question was, who would be the candidates? First of all, Hitler, who meanwhile had been granted German citizenship, because in one of the Länder governments, the Nazis were in a coalition government. And in one of these Länders, he was granted by a National Socialist minister German citizenship, so that he could run for the presidency. And he was a serious candidate. Now, whom would the other Weimar parties mobilize? Now, there was no doubt that the communists, they would have a candidate of their own, because they had nothing to do with the other Weimar parties. The nationalists ultimately would also nominate one of their candidates. So the question was now, who would then be the candidate of the Weimar parties, that is, of the Socialists, the Zentrum, and the Liberals? In despair, these Weimar parties turned towards Hindenburg to run once more for another mandate, even though everybody knew that he would certainly not terminate his mandate. So in other words, Hindenburg at 87 became the candidate of the Weimar parties. Then there was a communist, there was a nationalist, and there was Hitler. In this first round now of the elections, Hindenburg missed narrowly by something like 0.4%, the absolute majority. In other words, he got 49.6 or 40. In other words, he just narrowly missed to be elected in the first tour. But of course, this was something the old man deeply resented, that he had not been elected right away, so that a second tour had to be held. Now, in the second tour, only the best place could run, and in this, of course, there was no problem. He was elected, but Hitler increased his vote by another 2 million. In other words, Hitler came out with a very decent result in the mid-40s. Hindenburg got in the 50s, but it was not just a poor result. Hitler had come out very strong. Now Hindenburg was the president, but Hindenburg was furious. He was absolutely furious, and he made Brüning responsible for his mishap in the first tour. And so the general Schleicher, who felt that the wind was turning in the entourage of the president, so Schleicher approached Hindenburg, and so Brüning will be dismissed. Victim of the president's, let's say, dissatisfaction over the presidential elections, and also victim also of Schleicher's intrigues. And now Schleicher brought in a man who was always, throughout his life, a nonentity, but who will play an important role in Hitler's rise to power. And this man's name is Papen, P-A-P-E-N. He is also on your agenda in FEST, but I'll say even before you get down to FEST a few words about this Papen. Papen had been originally a member of the Zentrum Party, Catholic. And, but he had made a rich marriage into an industrialist family, and he shared in reality much more with the nationalists, with the conservatives, than with the Catholics. During World War I, he had been attaché at the German embassy in Washington, and he was forced by the United States government to leave because he was indulging in spy activities. When he came back to Germany, he practically situated himself on the conservative spectrum, close to the nationalists. But his real influence came from the fact that he knew Schleicher well, the general, and that Schleicher and he himself, that they had served in the same regiment in World War I than Oskar Hindenburg, the president's son. So in other words, there were personal intrigues and connections. So this allowed Schleicher imagined that Papen would be his willing puppet, and that he would obey him, that he could only pull the strings and Papen would do what he wanted. And so, to the great surprise of everybody nobody expected this nomination, when Brüning was dismissed, Hindenburg named Papen new chancellor, on the condition, of course, that he would gain a majority in the German parliament. Now, when he addressed himself to the German parliament first, it was evident that he had not the slightest chance to gain a majority, because nobody liked him. Nearly all political parties, except for the nationalists, distrusted him. And so Papen considered, as he had no chance, and as he had not learned the lessons from Brüning's mishaps, he considered that the best way to win a majority, guess what? He went to see the president and said, we dissolve parliament. Dissolve parliament in July 1932 and have elections. Now, this opens up a very wide arena, and so I rather stop here and not see, we'll see next time what the consequences of these new elections were for parliament and for the Weimar Republic. That's key point here.